You might want to move the seat all the way back so you can unscrew the trim from the front here, and then you move the seat all the way forward so you can get to the bolts at the back. You will need to remove the screws at the top of the seatbelt guide here. These two screws that hold it on. Just let it loose, that should be fine on both sides, yeah? Okay, so once you've removed the bolts from the back holding the seat down, move the seat backwards so that you can reach the bolts at the front. And then you can undo the front bolts. That should be down here, as you can see. Once you've removed the 4 bolts that hold the seat down, you will also need to remove the wire, the connector here that powers the power seats. So it's just a simple unplug on both sides. So once you've removed both seats, you'll want to remove the side trim with the screws here, here, and here. In order to pull this trim off here, you need to pull this lever a little bit back and wiggle through the hole so that it pops out. You'll see that later. But there's another screw here as well. So 1, 2, 3, 4. And it's pretty much the same on the other side. I need to undo the 2 screws that hold this cover onto the side here, and then that should just pull out. I've actually just put a bit of rubber over it just to sort of seal it up when I close the D-tabs. You don't need to do that, but it's just a nicety. So I'm going to undo the screws on both sides, pull those off both sides. Okay, next on the list is the center console, and the first place to start is actually with this shifter. It's got a little C-clip here that you need to get a screwdriver behind and lever outwards. It's pretty simple. It's a bit of tension in it, but you keep levering it out and it should be fine. Just be careful not to damage the plastic and whatnot around it. And once that's out, then we'll be looking at getting some screws out from down here. These 2 screws, 2 bolts, I should say. And in the bottom here, there's 2 bolts down the bottom there. And once you've removed these 2 bolts holding the upper console in place, all you need to do is move this lever by pushing it, pulling it towards the bottom here, and then levering the upper console up and guiding it through that like that. You'll find some cables and whatnot that need to be unplugged here, so please do not pull it hard, just leave it dangling to the side and then we'll pull out those cables. I just happened to notice actually as part of the whole disassembly that I'm missing a bolt from down here. Not sure how that's happened. I've got these 2 bolts out down the bottom and that one's missing, so basically all I should really be able to do now is pull this whole console out. There will be a cigarette lighter cable that I'll need to disconnect from here. Otherwise I believe it should just pull right out. Going towards the back is probably a good idea. So I've got the center console out. Just as a handy tip, this park brake lever needs to be all the way back, really far back, so that the center console can lift up through this slot here. Yeah, it's not so easy, but it can be done without too much drama. My next task is the radio, and the bezel has to come off. This just basically pulls straight out towards you. Just do a little jiggle on the left, a little jiggle on the right, and maybe at the top corners, and it should pull straight out. To remove the radio, you've got 2 7mm bolts, one on each side, and you remove those and then pull the radio out and disconnect the connectors at the back. So I've just unscrewed, unbolted everything in the center console dash area. I've just put everything back a little bit so that when I pull the dash it's not going to get caught on anything. Actually, this glove box has 3 screws holding it. 1, 2, 3. And you need to unscrew it from underneath. So in order to release this glove box, it's just got these plastic sort of tabs that hold it in here. And you just push them in and it flops down both sides. They've got the tabs. This front instrument cluster bezel at the top here, that just simply clips in. So again, if we lever just the corners, gently, 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 we don't want to break anything, on the left, on the right, at the top, the bottom, lever it out a little bit, gently each time, and it should just pop off. So I've got 2 screws that hold this wonderful fiberglass cover on. One here, one there, and a button that needs to be unplugged. But first we have to undo the screws that hold this connector on. So we undo those screws and then undo these 2 screws at the top, disconnect this cable that joins this button, and we pull this fiberglass cover out that was created by Christopher Malloy. Next, take the cover off the fuse box on the side here and then undo this little screw, because that actually stays with the internals, yeah? So I've undone the 2 screws that hold the upper dash. You pull this up, you'll find a little connector here that needs to be unplugged for the security light, and then we should be able to slide that out. Okay, so we've removed the upper dash, disconnected this little security light thing, which by the way has a lever on this side that holds this tab in. And if you can see this tab here, there's a lever on the actual upper connector which you have to pull with your fingernail out that way so it can slide off, yeah? Next thing we need to do is actually undo the instrument panel with the bolts at the top here and here, and I believe underneath there's one here and one here. And then what we need to focus on is undoing the whole dash, which I'll continue on with in a minute. Okay, we need to undo the bolts that hold the top of the dash onto the car across the top here. There's 1, 2, 3, 4 bolts at the top, and there's 2 at the bottom on each side. You can see there's actually an earth that goes to those as well. So keep the wires handy, do not lose them. So for removing the instrument panel, I actually had to loosen the dash itself so that I could get a bit more height to lift this dash up so I could move the instrument panel out without having to remove the steering wheel. A bit of argy-bargy and pushing around and shoving things here and there, but it comes out. I mean, it's better than having to pull the steering wheel out. So my next task is to remove the tape from the air duct to the air conditioning vent here, and also in the middle and on the left hand side. And then I've got to be careful about the wires going to the fuse box on the left hand side as well. You need to disconnect the cables that go to these switches down the bottom here, and they will be at the back of the dash. Not sure if you can see it in this video, but you'll need to disconnect those cables there. So there's this switch for the glove box that needs to come out, and then the ventilation hose needs to be undone here. This is on the left hand side of the car. So the dash is out yet again. In order to actually pull the dash over to the steering wheel here, I removed the 2 bolts that hold the steering column on, which is screwing into the bottom here and on the other side, and then it slides over the top. Yippee! Hello once again, welcome to my nightmare right-hand drive 98 Firebird Formula. The air conditioning is now working, great. The controls are sort of working. They direct cold air to a point. It's not perfect, but I have tidied it up a little bit. I know it looks like a mess, but it's tidy, believe it or not. And the next step is I'm going to do a dry run with the dash. I'm going to put it in place to see where everything sits in case I need to tie things up or secure things underneath the dash. Before I actually put the dash on, I'm going to just put it in place to see how it fits. And first thing you need to do is to make sure that these bolts here are dropped down. I've actually put a spacer in there to let it sit in the right height, but I've dropped down that whole steering column. As you can see, it's just sitting there loose, held on by that bolt. I drop it down so I can actually get more height for the gap, well, the gap between the steering wheel and the glass. It gives me more distance between there so I can slide it over the top. So before I put the dash in, you might actually notice I put a bit of heat shielding where the instrument panel sits. I may have to cut bits of it here and there just to make sure it sits in properly, but it's really more for a bit of padding so it doesn't move around too much. Also put a bit of foam along the edges here to fill up some of the gaps when you put it in. Even behind the radio bezel, a few little padding bits here and there just to make it a bit more sort of spongy so it doesn't rattle and it sits in nice and tight. So once you've got the dash sitting in place over the steering wheel, you've got to make sure that this connector is pulled through the gap at the top there. So make sure that connector's coming through. Make sure your air ducting is actually sitting close to where the actual vents are up here, because you're going to connect that up with a screw and some tape. And there's a whole bunch of wires and cables behind here. Just gotta be careful that they're not tangled up with the bottom of the dash or anything. Gotta make sure they're sitting on their own. Over here in the middle, you gotta make sure that the hoses are actually sitting out here, so we can connect those up to the vents at the top, just above it. And also the control panel for your aircon, to make sure that's sitting out front so you don't have to try and dig it out later. You can just mount it with the screws. Another thing to be mindful of when we're putting all this stuff together is this little button here. That is actually the light switch for the console glove box thingy, and that has got to be mounted back up here somewhere. Don't know if you can see it in this video, but anyway, that is just be careful of the cables, because that runs through behind the dash right near the glove box. So I actually found it easier if I leave the dash a little bit loose at the top to feed the hoses in from the top, and also grabbing from the bottom here, so I can tighten them nice and tight. And actually doing the center ones here, these center ones, is easier to do those first. Okay, so I've clamped it here, and also on the other side here, so you can get the screwdriver underneath and tighten those clamps up. from underneath is easiest. Now I've got to put a clamp on that one and put it through to the middle. So what I've done with these center vents, if you can see, a bit hard to see there, is put that one that goes splitting into two on either side, the left and the right, so that it actually is a bit more symmetrical, and then the single one goes to the center here. Okay, so what I've done with this ducting here on the left hand side of the vehicle, I've actually clamped it down to the hose so it doesn't loosen up or dislodge. And I found it easier, just for reference, that if I take the fuse box panel and just move it out of the way, I can get my hands in behind and guide the hose and actually hold the clamp in place while I'm screwing it tight. So it's a bit easier when I reach out through the back here and get my hands in there and guide the hose through. So once that's done, I can just screw this fuse box back on. Okay, so I've had to re-engineer a few things. The hose on the left side here actually broke. So what I've done here, instead of trying to reconnect the hose to the HVAC box, the vintage air box, I've actually cut the hose here and joined it with a bit of plumbing pipe between the two with some clamps to hold it in place. And actually it's got a little bend in it, so it actually neatly tucks in up the corner here. Instead of it being all shoved in, it actually sits there nice and tight, and it actually moves the hose a little bit higher, so it'll be nice and close to the top here, and so it's not going to be in the way of the fuse box or any of that shit. Two clamps to hold it here, one at the back of the vent inside that clamps from underneath. I don't know if you can see it, and that's it. So something to note when you're doing all this work is to make sure this little connector here remains above the dash, because that is for the security light, and it's a pain in the ass if you put it all together and that cable's sitting in behind the dash. You're gonna have to dig it out. So before you start securing all the bolts to the top of the dash, I've actually only got a couple in there just to sort of hold it in place. But before we do that, we really want to unbolt this bolt down the bottom and put the actual tab on properly and securely, so that it will hold it in place ready for the top bolts to go in. For reference, that is a 13mm. So something else that's quite important, which I kind of neglected to mention earlier, before you go bolting the dash on, you need to actually put the instrument panel in here. So leave it loose so you can move it up a little bit, slide the instrument panel in, and then bolt it up, because you can't get the instrument panel in after you've bolted the dash on. Okay, so I've bolted on the instrument panel. There's just 4 bolts, 2 at the top, 2 down the bottom, and I've connected all the wires up to the headlight switches and even the fog light switch. It's a connector at the back, you can't really see it from here. The next thing I'm going to do is make sure that this steering is bolted up again, because remember we loosened that 2 bolts to make sure that steering column doesn't get in the way of the dash insertion. But now I need to bolt them up again, make sure it's nice and tight. So we've got the instrument panel plugged in. I'm not doing the top bolts yet. I've done the earth points down the bottom on each side. What I'm going to do is do a trial run, make sure everything's working before I go bolting it all together. So I'm going to reconnect the battery, switch it on, make sure the aircon's okay, and the next step is just bolting it all together and tidying it up a bit. factory, testing everything out. Where are we? That's going up to the top. Yes, very nicely. It's going to the front extremely nicely. Oh, it's cold. Air conditioning is working brilliantly. Test the lights. Lights are on. That's on high beam. Let's switch it off to high beam, make sure that works. Working, so everything is working, engine is running beautifully, smooth as a baby's butt, and there's less clutter in the engine bay than there was before. Some extraneous cables that we took out. Behind the dash is a lot neater, tidier. The dash is pretty much nicely done, no dramas there at all. Well, dramas always, but I've got to put the trim back on, but I won't do that until I get the stereo sorted out, I think. And the top dash piece, which I'm not going to put on until I've got some more things done. So we're going to secure the top bolts. That's a 7mm. There's one here, and there's one here, and one here, and one over the other side. To line up the holes and bolt it in. So once you've tightened the bolts on the steering column, it would be best to screw this panel back on, and then you can put the front fascia onto the instrument panel, and then you've got this OBD2 plug which you screw into the bottom of this panel.